Oh, yeah, it worked. So, welcome to our final panel discussion of the day, where we will be talking about Agile and legacy. And I have three experts on the topic here with me today, who hopefully will be doing most of the talking, and I can sit down and have coffee at last. So first up, I've got Dave Farley, who I've got kind of with Dave, I associate two things. One of them is he wrote the infamous Continuous Delivery book, which is humble, which everybody's supposed to have read, okay? And the second thing, which I take a perverse pleasure in, because it's how I started, is he's the man putting engineering back into software engineering. I think there should be a bit more of that. So Dave has a very good talk on that, which you can find online. And he also has a very good video series going around at the moment. So check that out sometime if you get a chance. Down here for me on the right-hand corner, I've got JB Rainsberger. This is the Agile coach who's both an Agile coach, who's both Agile and an Agile coach. But the better bit is he does probably the world's best introduction to test-driven development. So a man recommend if you're in this area, and his speciality, which he's going to bring, I'm hoping something's coming up here. He talks about the human-to-human interface and debugging the human-to-human interface. This is when you can really get going with JB and talk about this stuff. So, and last but not least, in my left-hand corner here, wearing the red shorts and weighing 230 pounds, is the Gojko.
You don't see that part.
Gojko said I just have to say it's Gojko, but no, Gojko's so good he has his own Wikipedia page, and in English as well, not just in French like JB. And Gojko's basically written several books which go from everything from specification by example to the impact mapping, and then humans versus computers, which is, the basic core problem we all have, I think. So we're going to be discussing basically this hot topic in a sense of Agile and legacy. And it's more of when we think about it, kind of a compatibility problem, or we're straight into this sort of mindset thing where there's a prevalent, I will say at least, there's a prevalent idea that these two things can't work together. This is kind of an idea that's out there. It's like you go into a company, you start to talk about Agile, and you've got all the guys, no, that's never going to work here. We're not doing that. Nope. That's not going to work here. We do this differently. We blah, blah, blah. And they will give you so long a list saying why all of this won't work. So I'm going to ask the guys straight up, and this is the bit that kind of has come out also from the questions that we got from the audience and stuff like that. I'm just going to sketch a situation or a similar situation I've seen in a few places and question whether this can be done differently or not.
Before you jump into that, I have to say one thing. Given how small you are on my screen, the resolution I have of you, and the way you look right now, Robert, I feel like I'm living a lifelong dream of appearing in a Dave Allen sketch. So this is really actually quite impressive for me. You have a very 1976 look about you right now, especially with the video quality that I'm seeing. So I just wanted to mention that before you got too serious. All right, now get serious. Go ahead.
Okay, Dave, you promised not to take out your Guinness mug so I don't get thirsty in the middle of this talk, okay? Oh, there it is. No. Rick, go get my pint of Guinness, please. Wait, roll back. So,
yeah. Agile, nobody's going to do it sitting back like this, yada, yada, yada. Go ahead.
Oh, no, not us. Okay, so guys, we're in a bank. We have a release cycle that basically takes 6 months, okay? It takes them about a month and a half to test anything before they put it live. They basically have a lot of host systems, which they've still integrated, maybe through a few services and stuff like that, but rolling anything out basically means they need to test everything from start to finish. It's a fair bit of manual testing, quite a little bit of it. You have a lot of host systems. You either still have bits of COBOL, RPG and other stuff knocking around in the system, and people are afraid to change any of this, because even though it's like really slow getting stuff to the customer, they kind of go, yeah, but it works, and we don't want to touch it because we're afraid, okay? So my question for each of you individually is, have you seen, let's say, financial institutions go from this kind of 6 months release? Is it possible with this kind of a code base, with this kind of an attitude, to get to a point where you say, guys, even if it's just once a month, that would be like pretty amazing. Who'd like to go first? Dave, why don't I?
Yeah, I'm happy to see that. Yep, I've absolutely seen organizations do that, not just banks, but all sorts of different kinds of industries. But yeah, so the example that I've seen of a bank doing that is probably ING in the Netherlands. There was a period where ING, the most common feedback that ING got on the App Store for their software, for their apps, was, why can't I vote 0 stars, because this is crap. And they turned that around. So they made a change, and they decided that they were going to make the change, and they just started working across the board, improving the frequency with which they worked. And the way that I talk about this is in the context of continuous delivery. But one of the reasons why I think continuous delivery is important, and an engineering tool, going back to what you said at the beginning, is because I think if you take an experimental approach to improving the rate at which you can deliver software, so you carry out a series of experiments, you try and make your builds faster, you try and improve your test, you try and improve the modularity of code, you try and reorganize the teams so that they can communicate more cleanly, and so on and so on and so on. If you do all of those things, you drive out all of the principles of agile thinking, lean thinking, DevOps thinking, and continuous delivery thinking. You can't do that with big teams. You can't do it with overly coupled software. You've got to dump manual testing to a large extent and do automated testing. You've got to do infrastructure as code. All of that stuff becomes kind of table stakes to be able to work at the kind of speed that we're talking about. So I think the way that I advise organizations to make this kind of change. It's sort of what I do for a living, the way that
make you slightly biased though in believing it works, Dave.
No, yeah, of course, of course. But I have been practicing this now for nearly 20 years in one flavour or another in different organisations, and I haven't seen it in a situation where it didn't at least improve the situation. There are certainly organisations where they've started doing this and they haven't got to what I would think of as, real continuous delivery and the real kind of highlands of performance and effectiveness. And when you see that, that is like the scales falling from your eyes. That is a different game to regular software development. And the numbers that come out for the organizations like that, the places like Amazon and Netflix and my organization, LMAX, those sorts of organizations were my former organization, LMAX. Those sorts of organizations can deliver higher quality software at a faster rate than most people have ever seen. They just can when you apply these sorts of ideas. The other thing, I'm going to shut up in a minute, but I'm not going to get another word in with these two. We all talk a lot. So the other thing that I would say is that you must remember that Amazon started out as one of those kinds of legacy organizations. Amazon was a big PHP 3-tier application that was constrained by its own technology. It was adopting this kind of thinking and approach and reworking their systems that got them to where they are now. So it's not, can you start from here? Nearly everybody, it's very, very unusual that organizations start with a clean sheet of paper. I've done that twice.
Oh yeah. And who needs to make the entire organization work this way starting day one?
Absolutely.
Sometimes just the way that we frame that's a bit of a misnomer. There's no need to say Netflix do this, Amazon do this, and so on. It always starts with every success story I've seen boils down to the combination of one frustrated, bottom of the organization chart worker who just decides, I'm not going to take this anymore. They have their network moment. I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore. Combined with one key person in a position of authority who already believes in some of the things that we have talked about. And by the way, when we say believes, I want to say not believes, already understands how and why this works. And so you have now a movement that's starting from somewhere in the bottom. You have, and that person might not even know that there's support 4 levels up in the organization chart waiting for them to have a conversation with each other at some point in the future. What it just means is that some of the kinds of obstacles that one might ordinarily expect to encounter either don't happen, or aren't nearly as bad as we expect, or move out of the way magically much more easily than one might expect. And the hilarious thing about that is that for the programmer, tester, whoever it was, the first line manager who tried to lead this revolution, they'll never know about the universe in which they didn't have that magic executive who happened to already understand how all this works. They don't even know how terrible it could have been. All they do is they experience that we tried it, we ran some experiments, it worked. Yeah, it took some time. Yeah, it took some effort. Yeah, there was some uncertainty, but we managed to do it. And the bad side is there's a bit of survivorship bias there, which maybe gives people too rosy a picture of how this will go. But on the good side, if nobody succeeds, then there's no hope and nobody will try. So we need at least some of those good luck stories in order to provide a reason for anybody to get out of bed in the morning and try to do this. I mean, that's part of what I specialize in, is helping individual people feel like, well, even if I don't transform the entire organization, if I can make my immediate environment do this better, if we can do it in a way that allows us to work more harmoniously with each other, more harmoniously with stakeholders, more harmoniously with sponsors, more harmoniously with the poor people who are, forced to be product owners. If we can do that and work with a lot less stress, then the worst thing that happens is that we have a good time building stuff that doesn't really add much to the bottom line. There are worse problems. At least we've proven that the bottleneck is somewhere else and not with us, so that if this company fails, it's not our fault. We're not the bottleneck. We're just moving along, doing what we can. And when the rest of the organization figures out where the real bottleneck is, at least the bottleneck's not going to shift back to us. It'll go somewhere else. Great. Having more capacity seems like a nice thing to do.
Just on that idea, like a few years ago, I used to work with Dan North, who's a friend of mine, and Dan is fantastic at kind of coming up with little memes that just kind of stick in the back of your head. And at one point, he came up, while we were together at ThoughtWorks, he came up with a bunch of consultancy patterns, and my favorite one, the one that stuck in my head, is follow the line of most resistance. So when somebody says we can't do that here, you say, who says we can't do that here?
That's right.
So let's go to that.
Yeah.
And then you think, who says we can't do that? And then it's a way of finding that person that says, yes, you can do this here.
Gojko, are you sitting there going, no, this never happened to me? Or...
No, I'm just thinking, JB said all successful stories kind of don't start with somebody saying, oh, Netflix or oh, Amazon. But at the same time, I don't know how many, insane organizations I've seen where it's a massive financial institution, and somebody there starts with the question of, oh, what does Spotify do?
We just had a talk about that.
Which is totally insane, but these things do happen, and your session title is kind of quite a loaded question, really, in terms of agile and legacy, and agile is not a single thing. There's like almost every large financial institution today claims to do some sort of Deloitte crash train agile diagram with 5 million release trains or things like that.
Yes, it's okay. You can stay safe. It's all,
that's so. It's a big question. Like, what do you mean? Can it work? So I've done wonderful work with large financial organizations where they've gone from a fake release cycle of months. What I mean by fake is actually nothing important happens, and what they wanted to release gets pushed to kind of the next one, to somewhere where they do get every month, every 2 months, some important stuff out, and people are really, really happy. And usually, my experience is kind of slightly different from what JB had, where somebody at the bottom starts with a kind of good idea where people at the bottom usually get ignored in organizations I work, but somewhere in the middle, the chairman of a multinational investment bank is not going to care about Agile, and several people below him are not going to care about Agile, and somewhere in the middle of the org are usually people who need to push this through. But yes, you can do good software in large organizations. It's not impossible. It's just that, in my experience, usually you need a crisis to drive you, because large organizations, especially banks, tend to have too much money. And with too much money, there's no urgency to do anything interestingly important. There's kind of usually a gravitational pull of existing processes and existing workarounds for existing processes to kind of sustain what they already do. And I think when you have a big change in the market, or you have somebody's doing something relatively innovative, like Dave mentioned, LMAX, or you have a crisis that needs to, change how people work, then bureaucracy gets pushed away, rules get changed. People suddenly realize that, yes, you can do compliance by automating it rather than doing it manually. And a lot of other things suddenly kind of become possible when you have a crisis. So I think the bigger problem is most large organizations are really not bottlenecking on software, or not really having a crisis. So good software is just not that important there. And
I think that's an experience. Yeah, sorry. I think that's an experience we can all relate to, that no matter what the industry is, a lot of the reasons why people don't seem to adopt these brilliant ideas we all have that are obviously a great way to work is exactly what Gojko mentioned, that they simply have too much money. And I don't mean that as a pejorative, but if you have too much money to care about the results, then there's a whole class of motivation that you're not going to have to change things, right? We've all said this in pub discussions, at conferences, whatever. Why is it that nobody can afford to do it well and everybody can afford to do it again? And that's part of, as Gojko said, either you have some rumblings somewhere in the organization chart where people just get fed up with this mentality and decide that they're going to do something about it in their neck of the woods, or a crisis happens where suddenly we don't have an abundance of cash. We do have some kind of panic. The market shifts in some huge way, and we suddenly are caught with our pants down needing to react. And this is where I think people make a very fundamental mistake, where even if they look around at their feedback cycles and figure out where the really long ones are and decide, okay, we need to do something about this, they immediately try to go from 6 months to 1 week, or from 1 year to 1 month. And they throw themselves into chaos, and they might as well just take a whole bunch of money out in the forest and set it on fire. One of the things that I think, one of the reasons why I think anybody can try to do this from wherever they are, is that it seems to suffice to look for a long feedback loop in their environment and just try to cut it in half.
Yeah.
That trying to go too short too quickly leads to chaos, resentment, fear, all those things. Some people love it and charge forward. Some people hate it and resist and maybe actively sabotage what people are trying to do. But if you try to cut that feedback cycle in half, enough things change that something happens, that there's some, organizational innovation, but it's an achievable goal in many cases, right? Going from 6 months to 3 months requires 1 or 2 or 3 fundamental shifts in behavior, but isn't likely to cause total chaos that then, causes somebody in a position of authority to panic and pull the plug. And then if you do that and let the system just heal itself and adapt to the new reality, and, we've taken a couple of big steps towards continuous delivery, or we've taken a couple of big steps towards better coordination between the people who are requesting features and the people building them, and then let that go for a couple of cycles until we realize that, well, we managed to figure out how to do some things that are a little more agile, for want of a better term. Now that's got boring. Where's the next annoying feedback cycle? Cut that one in half again. And if you just keep doing this, you'd be amazed at where you are in 5 years' time. A time horizon that I'm sure many executives would be quite happy with. If we walked in and said, we can get you from there to here, or from here to there in 5 years, they couldn't pull out their credit card fast enough to pay us. And it can be as simple, not easy, as Just cut the feedback cycle in half. Don't try to respond to the crisis by fixing everything and making it perfect on day one. I've yet to see that work, and I imagine it can only work by accident.
That's pretty much my sales pitch. Is going into organizations and saying, I can definitely help you transform, but it's going to take you years, because that's the truth. That's what it's going to happen. And you can kind of have the local effect. You can have an impact on a few individuals or a team, and you can get a win in that area, absolutely. But you're not going to change a big organization. And I think at root, this is kind of one of those problems of a difference in philosophy. I talk about the kinds of development that all of us, promote and talk and discuss as being a genuine paradigm shift. This is a radically different way of thinking about what software development is and how it should be undertaken. And that's challenging. That means that nearly everybody's career that they've spent up to this point in a big bank or a big institution working traditionally have been doing things slightly wrong. That's terrifying.
Yeah, we have to. That's one of the first laws of consulting, right? That your mere presence means that somebody there has been doing something wrong, and you already have something to fight before you've even opened your mouth.
Yeah. And so you're trying to help people see things in a different light and adopt some ideas that will be fundamentally challenging. So even if the technical things were that simple, just that change of getting people to think about things differently is going to take years in a big organization. So it's definitely challenging, but the value is there. I part of my engineering thing is that I believe that we are at the point now where there are principles that we can point to say those are engineering principles, and if you adopt them and apply them, you will get a better outcome than if you don't. Because that's what engineering does.
Just for the fun of disagreeing with you.
Good.
You said the value is there. I think if the value was there, people would be doing this a lot more. And for a lot of these places, the value is just not there, because doing software in a better, faster, whatever way might feel good to people that are involved in software, but
not the bottleneck.
Outcome of that is negligible. It's
My thing is that it's a bit deeper than that, though. I go back to what JB was saying about the impact of this is that it's not just about creating better software faster. It's the impact on the organization as a whole. And I think that I'm a software developer, so I see things through software developers' glasses. That's my worldview. But what I perceive is that what our industry has done is that it's changed the way in which businesses operate to the point where that they can no longer effectively operate without changing the way they think about what business is. And that's when you get into these ideas of digital disruption and those sorts of things. If you want to move at that pace, then from a product point of view, from the point of view of getting products into the hands of users and figuring out what impact those products have on users, whatever the product, you need to be going faster, and you need to be doing that with more quality. And I think that we know how to do that, and that's why Amazon and Google and those sorts of organizations, much as they're kind of old saws to examples to beat people up with, they are amongst some of the most successful businesses in the world, because it's not just about software. Software is a tool, but because they're able to operate their business differently. And I think that's the real impact of this kind of engineering thinking when it's applied. You can look what Ericsson are doing now with the 5G rollout, or what Tesla are doing with cars. You don't think of them as software organizations, but it's absolutely engineering thinking and the kind of software engineering principles that we're talking about that enable those sorts of businesses.
Gojko, are we back there? What you're talking about, is it that although from our, where we go in and we look at how they make software, and we could tear our hair out and think, how can you live like this? Because this hurts my heart to see the way you guys are working, so to speak. And what you're saying is, yeah, but the company's doing fine, basically, on a, its balance sheet.
On a longer cycle, what Dave talks about is absolutely true. And you get, Amazon disrupting the Walmarts of this world and Asdas of this world on a shorter cycle, kind of where an executive looks at his bonus and things like that. Yeah. They've mentioned Ericsson. So, there's Ericsson competes with 3 companies in the world. There's Nokia Siemens Networks and there's Huawei. Sorry, no, it's not Nokia Siemens Networks anymore. It's called something differently. And like there's Huawei. So there's not going to be a new startup in that space over, next 10 years, definitely. If you look at banks like, okay, there have been attempts in the UK to start new banks like Monzo, and there's this Revolut horribleness that,
N26, yeah.
Runs people, but they're really kind of in a tough space because the entry to that market is so difficult that the banks don't really, it's like a cartel. They don't actually have competition, and when they do have competition, they're not competing on the basis of software. They're competing on something else. So yes, on like a 10-20 year cycle, I think by doing engineering in an organization like that, you can get faster operations, you can issue loans better, you can reduce your transactional costs, you can completely do really interesting stuff, but you can make that same kind of money by bribing a Mexican overlord and do that in
and you either have that talent or you don't, right?
Yeah, and you do that in a month, and then it's the same kind of value. So that's why I think in these places there's really no urgency to do something with software. There's always going to be a shorter-term solution that is not really looking at the long-term view and not really looking at re-engineering the organization. And the point I'm trying to make is I think software is, and you're absolutely right, Dave, it's kind of running the world now. It's running all this stuff. It's all the big companies are, software companies now in a sense, but you have Tesla and you have all these existing car makers that are going to sell cars for the next 50 years, and the governments are going to keep bailing them out. And they don't need to be like the best software company in the world. They just need to have enough software that's good enough not to get in the news every month for losing all the customers' data. If they get into news once a year for losing all the customers' data, that's fine. I mean, we've seen that being fine.
Yeah, so this is a big deal for me. Some people might think of what Gojko's saying as a reason to say, right, let's just pack it in. There's no need to do any of this stuff. It doesn't matter. I see it as an opportunity. This means if we're that far away from the bottleneck in trying to help people change the way they build software, I see good news in the idea that maybe our results don't matter that much. Not because it's an excuse to do bad work, but because it's an opportunity to experiment, to try things. And I go into groups, especially individual groups, not even necessarily at the level of, say, a 200-person part of the organization, and just say, look, the bad news is nobody really cares how well you build software. And the good news is nobody really cares how well you build software. You have tremendous freedom here. And the worst thing that'll happen is that you'll make some improvements to the way you work, and your manager might notice, and your manager's manager might notice, and it might not go any further. And you can choose to see that as a failure to have impact on the organization, or you can see that as a sign of having freedom to just keep improving as much or as little as you want. So now how do you want to work? That's part of the way in which, for me, we can use the agile ideas, the lean ideas in our work, because ultimately, if you represent 0.3% of a regional profit and loss statement, you have an awful lot of freedom to do whatever you think might help the immediate organization. And I one of the things I try to do is I help people see that as liberating and not as and not as hopeless.
At the same time, there is an argument there that if you do find yourself in a place that actually is important, it's kind of like The core domain of DDD is supposed to be very small. Well, the core domain of an org is also very, very small. If you find yourself working on something that genuinely is core, then, it does make a difference. And then it's much, much easier to adopt good practices. It's much easier to deal with all sorts of stuff. So, I think for people, one of the things I know I might sound, depressing, but I wasn't trying to do that. The point I was trying to make is if people want to do really good software, they should find places where good software is important, either in their organization or in some other organization. Working on a piece of software that nobody cares about and trying to gold plate it is, it's a nice exercise in futility. But if you go and do something that's really important somewhere else, or find a part of your organization where the software is important, then it works great.
Let me refine that strategy. If you find yourself in a part of the organization or in an organization where software doesn't matter, that is your opportunity to practice and learn and make mistakes, when the worst that happens is you lose your job, but you're not going to take anybody with you. And as you develop those skills over a few years, and when you reach the point where you have that frustrating feeling like nobody around me is going to get it, I know the one way to do things and the people around me are never going to change. Maybe that's a sign that you are ready to go find one of those organizations where software actually matters, and then you can exploit all those amazing skills that you built up over a 5-year period. I'd like to thank IBM Toronto for offering me that opportunity at the beginning of my career.
Writing software that didn't matter.
Oh yeah, I worked there for 4 years, and I spent a grand total of 2 days working with a customer who actually cared about anything that I built. And that gave me, when I finally realized that was going on, after I was disillusioned, my immediate thought was, wow, I can screw up an awful lot and nobody will mind. And I think there are a lot of people, again, who might see that as, some of us have read 3 Signs of a Miserable Job, and irrelevance is one of the signs of a miserable job. Oh, I'm in the wrong place. Not necessarily. It just means that you're in a place where you can afford to learn, and your failures will have no impact beyond you losing your job. But otherwise, you're not going to take people with you. You're not going to ruin a company. You're not going to cause anyone to go bankrupt. You're just going to be annoying, and then you'll leave. In that kind of an environment, there's a lot of opportunity to learn. Then you could practice all this stuff and not worry at all about what the results are. Just learn, and then find yourself maybe move towards an organization where they actually have some real motivation to do things differently. And when you find that organization, you're built for them. You already have what they want.
So I consider JB and Gojko friends and fellow travelers. We are allies in a common cause. But for the sake of an interesting conversation, I'm going to disagree. So I love.
Thank you. Thank you. That's what I wanted.
We're interesting even when we agree, Dave. Come on.
Cool.
Huge introduction. I now expect you to say something horribly offensive.
No. So I love JB's take on this, and the idea that working in a job that doesn't matter is an advantage. I definitely recognise what you're talking about, and I absolutely recognise what Gojko is talking about in terms of the impact. But I come at this from a slightly different angle. So in the UK, we're having a fairly poor response to the COVID system at the moment, and one of the things that happened was that the track and trace data was stored in an out-of-date Excel spreadsheet, which had a limit of 65,000 rows in it, which truncated the data and lost tens of thousands of records in the process.
Yeah, the stats were excellent for a while.
Yeah, they were wrong, but they were excellent, which means
it was world beating. World beating. No other country got it that wrong.
Yeah, and to be fair, that it was also bloody expensive. That Excel spreadsheet cost the government $12 billion. So So there's something weird going on there. I could have done the same job for just a single $1 billion and had the same result. So my problem is the windmill that I am tilting at is that the software development has grown at this ridiculous rate over the past few decades, and we are still a young profession, and I don't think that we have in place the disciplines that allow us to do a professional job very often, sometimes when it matters. I think that any of the three of us, of the four of us, looking at this and saying, you wouldn't use a spreadsheet to store that kind of data in.
I would just use a modern file format.
Yeah, you just look at this. It's obviously ridiculous, and then you test it. You try and figure out a way of figuring out whether it's going to work at the scale of that. That's what engineering thinking brings. You start to think about measuring things and evaluating things and getting feedback on things, carrying out experiments. That's what really matters. Controlling the variables. Those are the principles that seem to me to underpin something else. So I'm interested in that, and it's for me, it doesn't feel as though that's just about technical purity. I think it has an impact in the world. I think I loved Gojko's book about humans versus computers, which showed the kind of the social impact of software systems and the ridiculous ways in which you can find. In order to be able to do a good job of this stuff that matters in the world, I think this is genuinely world-class difficult. I think that there are aspects of software development that are up there with kind of quantum physics in terms of how complicated and difficult it is to reason about these things. We ought to be applying effective, thoughtful, intelligent approaches to solving these problems, which limits some of those outcomes. And absolutely, so it's not always going to work. Not everybody's going to adopt them. It's not always going to have, I think it's always going to have a business impact, but it's not. Some businesses are going to be successful despite being crap at building software. But I still think I am nerdy enough to still think that there's real value in just trying to polish that stone just a little bit better. So it's just a little improvement. So I decided when I became a consultant, I would take JB's advice when he was thinking about that person at the bottom of the stack. If they can make a tiny little improvement in their own local circumstances, great. If I could have a tiny impact on developers that read my books, watch my channel, my YouTube channel, whatever else it is, if I could impact just a tiny amount, I will feel like that's a worthwhile job to improve our approach.
Now, so I guess did anybody else notice any disagreement in there? Because I didn't.
The question there, I guess, is how do you scale up getting people to learn about these things? Assuming, kind of going back to the topic of the panel, it's legacy, which assumes large organizations and things like that. So how do you scale that rather instead of one-on-one consulting? Where do you scale this, and how do you scale this to a large org? That's, I guess, an interesting question.
It is an interesting question and something to experiment with. I think one of the ways in which you scale it is over time. You take many small steps, and I think that's the philosophical difference. I think we're all trying to find ways of scaling the message. So, I have online training courses and YouTube channels and blogs, and I know JB does online training courses. Gojko, you blog about things and have products that kind of demonstrate some of these ideas. So I think we all kind of try and find a way of getting our ideas out and hopefully finding ideas that are going to be useful and resonate with people. So that's
I've been teaching surviving legacy code on my own with TechTalk. I would have been doing it in fact, I should be doing it in the TechTalk offices right now in a normal year. Right? This is the week that I would normally be in Vienna.
Yeah.
So and I think that one of the difficulties we have is that if someone's going to judge the value of that training, of that learning, however we do it, writing books, if someone's going to judge that based on the results that it creates, we're in trouble because the feedback cycle is way too long. We're not going to create, especially if we're not the bottleneck, right? If everything we've said is true so far and we're not the bottleneck, then relying on the results, this is going to sound so self-serving, but I still think it's true. Relying on the results as judged by the impact we have on the larger organization is not going to give anyone, on average, any indication that any of the investment was worth it. The how we need to judge that has much more to do with what does it mean for the people involved in doing that work, and not just in the rosy picture, I want to be happy in my job, but let's think about it more practically, right? The most common outcome of my coaching has been for organizations or my training even, is to find one or two programmers that I work with over a period of several months who like what I have to teach, who show an affinity for it, who develop some skill. The gap between their effectiveness and the effectiveness of the people around them widens. They become frustrated. Not enough changes around them because I haven't prepared them enough for that feeling. And they quit. And what happens is the individual people benefit a lot from my training, and the company who has paid me for it, frankly, gets the short end of the stick. And it took me a long time to understand that part of what I need to do is to prepare those people, the people who really get the message and who benefit from it, and who, where it actually changes their profession, to remind them that we're not here to change the organization necessarily. That might be a pleasant outcome of what we do, but that the most we can hope for in the next year or two is to make everyone nearby us feel better about the work that we're doing, not just because it's nice, but because it means they can bring more energy to the work and they can do better work. And maybe they can then take some of that energy and give it to the other people around them and help them do better at what they're doing. So that now 20 people are improving instead of just one. And then that 20 can become 50 and that 50 can become 200. And if it turns out that we're in one of those organizations that doesn't care, then that's fine. The worst thing that happens is we deliver better results, and we feel a lot better about the way we work. And even if it doesn't make anybody happier above a certain level in the organization chart, we enjoy our job more. Who doesn't want that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My consultancy works a little bit differently. My professional career, I when I was actually writing systems, I recognize exactly what you're saying, kind of thing. I was either in an organization where I'd be kind of giving those people air cover and helping to grow them in the way that you described, or I was kind of a member of the team and we'd just be doing stuff, and sometimes we left and sometimes we stayed and doing the same kind of things. My professional career since I became a consultant has moved on a little bit, and I think that what I do is that I'm probably the person that consults most directly to the people that Gojko was talking about, the kind of middle people in an organization who get it to some degree, who want to make a change, and I try and get their backs, I suppose, and try and help them think about things the right way, use the right tools to make an impact and that kind of stuff. So I'm often talking about organizational strategies and those sorts of things more than architect and code. Sometimes it usually takes me a while to be able to talk about the more technical stuff.
For me, it's the exact opposite, because it starts with a programming problem, and then eventually within 2 hours we're talking about, well, why aren't you talking to that person over there? Oh, that's the architect, they don't like me. And then it's 2 or 3 hops to a second line manager who needs some help about figuring out how to do all this stuff.
So my impact is a little bit different in terms of organizational things, very often, and then I have a few clients where I kind of get into more detail, and just stop trying to pull this back onto the theme, I suppose.
Which I go on. I was about to add, go on.
So I I think you need. I think you need to, in order to make the kind of change that you need to in a legacy organization, then you've got to attack it from different points, and you absolutely have to find and grow those people that JB's talking about, who can be hopefully the change agents in an organization if you get it right. And you need to coach them and help them and so on. But you've also got to be engaging with other people who really don't get it yet and saying, you know, this is what we're trying to achieve. This is why this matters. This is what you're going to get from it. Give us some time, you know, and get some kind of buy-in to those sorts of things too, I think.
Can we just, I mean, it's been really interesting to talk about, because it's always, in the end of the day, really a people issue. And it's an organization, and it's a value issue, Gojko, as well. How important is this to the organization to make a difference? How much can I find personal fulfillment in my ability to do my job better, even though maybe the organization doesn't really care about it? But just to bring it back into legacy, because the kind of questions that came up from people were really, and I mean, listening to what you guys were saying there today, an important thing was it's the small steps. And I've heard you talk about this, JB, and in particular, and I think people seem, because the question is, can you automate the testing on legacy systems that are in COBOL? You know, can you actually set up a CI/CD that's actually going to run, or at least a CI or something that's running either on COBOL, RPG, or sometimes it's a database script is basically the logic.
What you're talking about is software. Software is automation. You're asking, can I automate automation? Yes, of course you can.
Yes.
It's a question, how much does it cost, and you know, where are the benefits? But it's software. At the end of the day, you can automate a robot clicking a button every 10 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
Some people do that, but you know, it's server-side implementation of a person sitting on the other end of the world. But it's software. Come on, I mean, software is automation by its very definition. So yes, you can automate it. It's just people being silly and trying to find basically an excuse not to, you know, change the process. But at the end of the day, you know, it's either politics or it's some money somewhere. I worked with a very large bank where we've automated pretty much most of the acceptance testing in a part, and they kept insisting that somebody else does manual testing for about 3 weeks every time they need to release. And at the end, we realized there's, you know, some guy who's 3 levels above the people I was speaking with, who has family in the village where they will employ 500 testers on the other end of the world. If you replace them with the shell script, suddenly these people will lose their jobs because the bank is not going to pay them anymore. Yeah. And then he's become the villain of the village when he goes back to visit his mother. So, and now he's the hero because his bank employs everybody in the village.
Yeah.
So most of the time, it has nothing to do with can you automate COBOL. It's kind of other stuff that creates problems in large organizations.
So there's those kinds of Okay, I'll take it. There's those kinds of unintended consequences, but also there's a little bit of that, like, you know, a lot of people have the idea that automation is a way to go from here to here, to try to take the feedback cycle down by 95% in one step, and then they kill themselves. I mean, obviously Gojko's right in of course it can be done. And then the question becomes, so is it worth doing? Well, do we have to go from here to here? One of the first things think about how to automate things. The first step is to try to do it by hand more than once, and then be able to do it by hand more than 3 times, and then be able to do it by hand the same way every time, 5 times in a row. And when you get to that point, if you can write down the instructions for someone else to follow, and they can follow it accurately 99% of the time, now it's just a question of figuring out which programming language to use to teach the computer to do it. I mean, that idea of how to automate things is orders of magnitude more important than the question of whether we can do it in COBOL or PL1 or RPG. I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. But as long as we cling to this idea that thou must automate everything from the beginning and have it working straight away, then it's always going to seem like an insurmountable challenge, and nobody will try to do it unless they just get fed up. We had one of these experiences at IBM where there was something that was utterly impossible to automate, 75 steps. And finally, one of us just said, I've had enough of this. And he and I sat down for 9 straight days and said, we're not going to do our regular job. We're going to automate this thing until it's out of the way. And nobody thought it was going to work, and it worked, and we were heroes. That 1-2 week project helped build my career. And it really boiled down to a combination of we just assumed that it was possible because, of course, it's possible in principle. And we reached the point where we had our personal crisis. We just said, I've had enough. I'm going to do this. I don't care if anybody fires me. And it's either going to work or it isn't. I've never heard an automation story that works differently from that. Or I guess you might have the people who are like naive and don't even think it's hard and just do it, right? The whole Enrico Fermi story. I didn't know they were open problems. But by and large, it really boils down to there's a crisis somewhere and someone decides, I've had enough of this. I'm just going to do it. Of course it's possible. Why wouldn't it be?
So Dave, you mentioned kind of consulting memes. One of the things, I don't know where I picked it up, but it's absolutely been true every time I wanted to use it, is whenever people say it's impossible, what they actually mean is it's very expensive.
Right. It's very expensive, or I don't want to do it.
Yeah, and even
that's also, it's very expensive. You know, I don't want to.
Exactly, it's expensive to my psyche.
It's expensive. So it's and I think getting people into the frame of mind where whatever they say it's impossible, to say it's very expensive, but then looking at, well, how can we reduce the cost of that somehow? We don't have to completely eliminate it, but we can find the causes of the cost and gradually remove them.
I think that's one of the interesting things that's when I talk about continuous delivery, and you look at the State of DevOps report and the Accelerate book, which are important in the kind of consultancy that I do, as data that kind of gives some evidence that these things work better. You know, it's actually not expensive to do these things. The alternative is more expensive. It's just you know, the short-term sense of impossibility that people apply to it, which absolutely is about expense, but also about time and effort, and you just got to
expense as well.
Yeah, but you've just got to start chipping away. You know, organizations that practice the kind of approach that I talk about spend 44% more of their time on useful work than organizations that don't. That's ridiculously efficient in comparison. And so, you know, this is an investment that people need to take. I think that's a mistake that people too commonly make is assuming that these things are, and we developers make that. We assume that it's going to be more effort to write tests. It's going to be more effort to do good design, and we haven't got time because you've got to build all these features. That's just dumb. It's just like driving your car without putting oil in it. You're gonna grind to a halt at some point.
That's why I became interested in a lot of the cognitive distortions around this stuff, because you know, we have the problem that sometimes the cost is purely psychic, right? Sometimes it's just about how we're thinking. Sometimes the cost is invisible, so it's difficult to quantify. And if you're dealing with both of those things, then it's going to be very hard to make an argument that's based in so-called objective reality. And so I thought, well, you know, I banged my head against that wall for 12 or 15 years. Maybe it'd be a good idea to look at some of the cognitive distortions. Like if you sit in traffic and you don't move for 20 minutes, but you spend an hour getting there, that somehow feels worse than driving at half speed and getting there in 75 minutes. Yeah. You got there in 60 minutes. What's the problem? Well, the problem was I sat there and for 19 minutes and 40 seconds, I ruminated on the fact that I wasn't moving. Well, okay, if you're aware of that, then maybe you can inoculate yourself against that cognitive distortion, and that might help you evaluate the cost benefit differently than you would if you were so-called trying to be objective. And in a lot of cases, a lot of the resistance to what we're suggesting boils down to these silly bugs in a human brain that the more aware you are of them, the less they hurt you. You can't fix them all. But think of how easier it is for us to cover each other's blind spots if we talk about them, if we're open about them, and we explicitly agree to try to support each other in that way. So what's really funny for me when I train people, even though my course is called Surviving Legacy Code, and we spend most of our time talking about code-related stuff, the real work seems to happen when we talk about those issues. And a lot of it really does seem to boil down to, if I can help them feel better supported in trying to make these technical changes, in refactoring more often, it's not that I need to convince them that the upfront investment is worth it. I need to help them feel comfortable and supported, and they will volunteer to make those investments because, of course, they know it'll work. It's they are afraid to fail, and specifically to fail in public. A lot of them are. And if I can help them with that problem, then they just magically do great work. And I didn't have to teach them any of that code-related stuff. They would have figured it all out on their own. The problem is I don't know how to sell that. So I sell the code stuff, and the people stuff goes in there the same way that you give medication to a dog. Yeah, you kind of have to trick them a little bit. Create an environment where they are open to those messages. Give it to them. See how they react. And that's the stuff they remember. They don't remember subclass to test followed by replace inheritance with delegation. They'll figure that out later.
This is a lot about what I mean when I talk about engineering. Is absolutely those human failings. One of the reasons why I'm interested in engineering is because I'm a popular science nerd. In my spare time, I read about physics and that kind of thing. And so as a result, one of my heroes is Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and one of Feynman's things is that science is our defense against ourselves. It's the defense against the ways in which we screw up as human beings, all of us, all of the time, and trying to protect us from our own cognitive biases that you were talking about. And that's why I think engineering matters. That's why I think that we start applying this kind of more rational approach to looking at things and evaluating things, so that we can kind of eliminate those things. Because if I guess, I'm going to get it wrong. If I measure, I'm going to be surprised, and then I've got a better shot at maybe getting it right.
Guys, we're running out of time here, which has been a really interesting talk. Gojko, do you want to say any one last thing, like about a village in Mexico, or?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the average work span of a CIO in a large organization is 1.5 years. There's data on that, and you get into this problem what Dave was talking about. Yes, of course, the petrol is going to run out of the car at some point, but as long as it doesn't run out on their watch, it's all fine. Yep. And they can leave it to the next person, and they can leave it to the next person. At some point, the petrol is going to run out, but by that point, all the people that have made the mess are going to get their bonuses and move on somewhere else. And
warn me, please, so that I can quit 2 weeks before you do.
That's I think the problem of thinking about this as long-term investments. And again, that's why you need to find a situation where it actually does matter and it's a crisis, and then you can deal with these things.
Yeah, if you're gonna make the argument about the investment, it has to be where it matters. And if it's where it doesn't matter, where the CTO is leaving every 18 months or CIO is leaving every 18 months, then that's where the argument for personal satisfaction and less stress at work, I think, seems to work a lot better.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for a really interesting talk. I would love to be able to continue this with you in person. That would be some night.
With beer.
Yeah, okay. My Guinness is cooling in the fridge over there, Dave, I can tell you. Listen, thank you so much, guys. That was really great. I love where we're actually going with this conversation. If we were to continue, this is going to get really about the whole politics thing. So thank you very much once more. One thing I have to say to the guys listening in, please, we have a survey about how the conference has actually been, okay, how well it's come across. We're experimenting with this. We're trying out new things. Please take the time to fill out the survey. Give us a bit of feedback about whether you think it, what worked well, what didn't work. Was the networking a good idea? Did you use the questions? How did the sessions work? Yep. Yes. Yeah. Please do the feedback. Thank you. Okay. And the next talk is when? In 5 minutes?
In 15 minutes.
In 15 minutes at 4:30?
Yes.
Next talk is at 4:30. Okay. Gentlemen, again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
How are you guys?